and welcome once again to Climate Talks. It's worth repeating over and over again that women are affected by disasters disproportionately. The bigger question, however, is why, and especially why when all the global frameworks for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation recognize the value of women empowerment and the staggering cost of ignoring it. Simple answer is that quantifying and visualizing gender inequality is still hard due to various reasons. In this episode of Climate Talks, we will be discussing the role of geospatial technologies in tracking the progress of gender equality. We will attempt to identify some of the gaps that exist in making that progress, and we will try to explain some of the dynamics involved in an innovative and exciting initiative being implemented in the Lower Mekong region through a unique partnership between USAID and NASA. For today's climate talks, we have four guests with us. Amanda Markert is the Regional Science Coordination Lead for SERVIR-Mekong with NASA. Dr. Peeranan is Director of ADPC's Geospatial Information Department and also Chief of Party of the SERVIR-Mekong project. We have Elizabeth Thipphawong with us, who is a civil society specialist working for World Wildlife Fund in the Greater Mekong. And our fourth guest is Ms. Bhawana, who is Senior Specialist of Gender and Inclusion at ADPC. And we'll begin with the involvement of NASA in tracking gender equality and how the most famous space agency on the planet has a key involvement in addressing the challenges we face. So, Amanda, could you please tell us more about the role of geospatial technologies in gender mainstreaming?
Sure, thanks, Vidya. So when we look at climate change, we see that marginalized, tribal, indigenous, and lower income communities are experiencing and projected to continue to experience the negative impacts and disproportionate burdens of these effects. So understanding these impacts and burdens are so critical to informing gender mainstreaming. So with geospatial technologies and using things such as NASA Earth observation data, we can help to identify areas that people and therein the risk of climate-related threats and environmental justices are located. So identifying these is very helpful to help ensure that everyone is able to mitigate these impacts and adapt to this changing world. And to accomplish this, it's so critical to work across interdisciplinary communities. So blending together decision makers, policymakers, earth and social scientists all together and sharing information. So when we look at what NASA and SERVIR is doing and the use of these data, we're working with geospatial technologies and these communities to make more gender responsive and gender inclusive environments. And we're doing this through a series of ways. This includes supporting women leaders and gender champions to create more equal opportunity within our work environments. We're also empowering women and girls to explore STEM fields, integrating gender considerations into the work that we do, and bringing social science and environmental justice together in big efforts, such as NASA's upcoming Earth System Observatory that we're forming. So we do this through using technology to address issues of populations that are disproportionately affected, bringing into considerations of gender, ethnicity, age, and social status. So it's so important to recognize that even within climate change, within disasters, different groups are going to be impacted differently from climate change. So this is where it's so critical to quantify and understand those components, work across disciplines. And I think the tool we'll be discussing today is a great example of the work being done on that.
So, I mean, as you said, NASA is actually encouraging policymakers and other groups to make use of your publicly available data to reduce the impact of disaster on women and other vulnerable groups. But do you face any kind of challenges while doing this work, and what those challenges might be?
Oh, of course, of course. You know, like with any project, with any effort, we're all running into challenges and working together to build solutions around them. Some of these big challenges, though, you know, working to identify risks of different communities and populations is definitely a challenge, and we need information from, you know, studying something like a flood or a hazard to understand, you know, maybe which location is affected more, but also having access to and having information about the human dimension. Who is being affected where within that location? What are some of the human demographics? What's the economics, the breakdown, the population numbers? And so having access to that information and blending it together is really critical. And it's something that we're all working together on. And another big component here is, in order to accomplish this, we need to have technical capacity to use the data, both data on something like a science phenomenon like a flood or understanding the weather or the climate, but also the human component. You need to have technical capacity in order to use that. So some ways that we're trying to address and mitigate this, and we're doing this at SERVIR and SERVIR-Mekong, is through conducting gender analyses, gaining access to some of these human dimension data, understanding decision-making processes, so understanding what the policy is, the processes of these different communities, but also building technical capacity. And we do this through working hand in hand and co-developing solutions, doing training. So it's not like we're developing something and throwing it over the fence. We're working together to address these challenges, because we definitely recognize that there are some, and there's always opportunity for improvement there. And we can do that through partnership, capacity building, and working together.
Thank you, Amanda, for the moment. And now I would like to turn to Dr. Peeranan. Dr. Peeranan, we know that accessing gender statistics is critical to examining and tracking changes in gender inequality. The creation, therefore, of the Gender Equality Monitoring Platform, known as GEM, is a major advancement. So, could you please tell us more about this tool in the context of the Lower Mekong region?
This is a web-based tool that we developed for the Mekong region for now. It's called the Gender Equality Monitoring Tool, or as you said, the GEM tool. And I will go by the GEM tool from now on. This was developed by the SERVIR-Mekong project, and as Vidya had introduced, this is a unique partnership between USAID, NASA, and ADPC, all of which are sharing the same goal of addressing gender and social inclusion gaps in climate resilience and disaster management. So what are the problems that we have at hand? We know that gender and social inclusion gap exists. And we know that we want to help reduce that gaps. But do we know where to start? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to see where gender inequality is most severe and how bad it is compared to other parts of the country? That is actually the main purpose of the GEM tool. It brings together gender data and visualization techniques through interactive maps, come together in a web-based format that is easy access by users. And the idea of visualizing and tracking gender inequality for us started in 2017. And it happened when our gender specialist, Ms. Ha Nguyen, met with the Women's Union of the Government of Vietnam to initially discuss different ways to monitor progress, to monitor gender equality at a local level. But then it turns into an idea of how we can derive a sort of gender inequality index for each of the provinces in Vietnam and use that as a sort of a goal to drive competition amongst the provinces to address their gaps in their own countries. And the idea back then turned into the GEM tool now. The gender inequality index that I mentioned actually goes from 0 to 1, 0 being total equality and 1 being a total inequality between gender groups. Putting all these provincial gender inequality indices on a map, then you will see vividly where gender inequality is worse within the country so that you can take actions based on that information. But the gender inequality index is not new. The concept of it is not new. In fact, what we did is that we adopted the methodology developed initially by UNDP, But we took it further. We took the methodology that was designed for country level adoption and applied it subnationally. That allows us, the users, to compare gender inequality indices between provinces in a country. We are also trying to make the gender inequality indices into time series data, which will be useful for tracking changes over time. And for you, any users, to be able to tell whether you are doing better in terms of addressing gender inequality in a particular area. You can see very clearly that you are doing better or worse than before. Now, I just want to say that we are on the final stretch of the GEM2 development before we can launch the tool to the public. So I would invite you to stay tuned on ADPC social media channels. We will announce the GEM2 launch within this month. I'll turn it back to you, Vidya.
Dr. Peeranan, as you said, that there are different kind of users of this GEM tool, and especially I see that you are targeting gender advocates, policymakers, researchers, and development practitioners. But in what specific areas do you expect them to make use of this platform and tool?
This is a very good question. I can already see 3 specific areas of use for the GEM tool. The first one being for us to simply use it as a tool to locate the provinces or parts of the countries where gender inequality is most severe. And why is this important? It is important because each of us who are working on addressing gender gaps, we have limited resources. By knowing where to start, where to prioritize our effort and resource, will maximize the good use into effective intervention for addressing gender gap. The second possible use of the GEM tool is, say, we have a way to look at the gender inequality over time in order to monitor progress and evaluate success of the projects and the projects that you are aiming to advocate for gender equality. By seeing the trend over time, you can see if you are doing well in terms of your projects and allow you to correct courses if you are not doing well to address the gender gap. And the third area that I can think of right now is for us to be able to use the GEM tool to dig deep into what are the root causes of gender inequality. Because the GEM tool provides not only the index, not only the inequality index, but also give the scores on the building blocks of the gender inequality. And that includes the reproductive health of females, the female empowerment, and the aspect of the access and participation in the labor markets from the gender groups. So you can, once you know all these scores, you can then pinpoint where you can start intervention that you know that will address the eventual gender inequality for your area.
Our next guest is Elizabeth Thipphawong. So, Elizabeth, I'm just curious to know, how do you foresee the GEM tool being used to mainstream gender in development projects?
As a practitioner, I'm going to say this may not be the most exciting answer, but it is certainly applicable, is that having gone through the GEM tool, it would be a massive time saver. So as Peeranan was mentioning before, we are often dealing with very limited resources. Not a lot of organizations have a dedicated gender specialist. So being able to access open data would allow us to eliminate redundancies in baseline surveys. And so this means that we can also, rather than be duplicating services or duplicating information and data collection, we can actually be building upon other people's work. And as a result of this, we can also be getting more diverse data sets. So this is the most immediate, and I would also say just the most exciting application of the tool that I can see in terms of where we look at the gender mainstreaming aspect of it, because it also means that more organizations who don't necessarily see themselves or identify necessarily at this stage as gender or feminist organizations can start to access more data, can start to integrate this into their own monitoring and evaluation planning, which we know developing thoughtful M&E is a really comprehensive and long process. So being able to, like I said, build upon other people's work. And one of the most important things that we're looking at when we are trying to develop programming, again, from that practitioner side, is ensuring that the work we're doing is not adding to the burden of the communities that we're trying to interact with. And so again, having a time-saving tool that's making sure that we're not replicating work that's being done in communities, being able to target at that subnational level, seeing where there's already been work done, it eliminates that burden because we're not going into the same areas, we're not asking the same questions. And this is really critical because often we really get ourselves into these silos in our work, even though we can have very similar fields and very similar research interests. And then when it comes to the point where you're presenting your findings, you find out that someone was working in a very adjacent community or a research project, and that you could have really shared resources. So again, having open access to data will, I think, create some really new channels for research and facilitate knowledge exchange among practitioners as well, and move us beyond just a kind of that baseline of gender segregation, but also will open some doors into people considering more of the comprehensive dynamics of gender mainstreaming. I see that there's already a consideration towards gender-based violence prevention mechanisms, which is something that we should also be integrating into our programming. And so again, there's a lot of organizations who are maybe new to this and don't know how to ask these questions or don't know where to access this data. And this platform would give people a lot to consider when they're developing their projects.
So may I ask that what would be some of its potential use cases and impact?
So I've been working in both the gender and climate change and also the emergency management spaces for nearly a decade. And these are both sectors which historically have really generalized their data in moments of disasters, especially climate-induced disasters. It's this many people were displaced, this much land was impacted. So we don't really necessarily always have the most diverse data. But the information that we take from these climate-induced disasters, from these incidents, then informs policies to move forward. So being able to have, again, more diverse data, more diverse information will inform future programming. And it means that rather than being reactive, we can be responsive in our programming. So I would see that as being the most immediate and the most important impact of this tool. And moreover, just personally speaking, when going through the tool initially, I think it's really important that it's framed in the sense of tracking progress, because as a woman of color working in climate, working in gender, we often can get really exhausted. It's a very taxing kind of space to be in. And because of the urgency of the topics that we're addressing, we're always coming through it the lens of the challenges. But it's also really important, and this is really underscored in this year's theme for International Women's Day, is that we also need to recognize the achievements that we've made. The achievements that we've made as individuals, as practitioners, as organizations, but also nationally in terms of the policies that we're adopting and the progress that we're making. So I think it's good that the tool is framed in this way as well.
And our final contributor today is Bhawana, our Senior Specialist Gender and Inclusion at ADPC. Bhawana, we are talking about challenges around mainstreaming gender in development projects. So would you highlight for us some of the key challenges that we face?
Well, Vidya, I think the key challenges we face today are primarily associated with policy and institutional aspects. Among those challenges, I would like to highlight the shortage of disaggregated data, not just by sex, by, as Amanda said, by other human dimension, as well as gender analytics. And this shortcoming has a major ripple effect as it leads to almost gender neutral and sometimes to gender blind policies and practices. For instance, if we talk about Southeast Asian countries, which are better compared to, relatively speaking, some of the South Asian countries in terms of the gender equality index, the data available for some sectors like health, education, and employment is better compared to other sectors like technology, energy, infrastructure, climate vulnerability, and DRR. Therefore, there's an urgent need to generate gender-related statistics across these sectors. And, currently we are undertaking some review of key sectoral policy documents of some of the South Asian countries under a project supported by the World Bank. And our initial findings basically suggest that majority of these policies, do not have fully integrated gender consideration in relation to climate resilience, and that's mainly because these policies are not backed up with gender analysis and disaggregated data. As a result, they have failed to acknowledge, particular needs and challenges of women, as well as overlook provisions for adaptations to address those needs. So these are basically challenges at policy level. Similarly, at institutional, the key challenges I would like to highlight is limited representation of women as stakeholder and decision maker. Also lack of technical capacity on gender mainstreaming. Also, I would say inadequate attention to gender responsive budgeting, as well as ineffective interagency coordination. These are basically the challenges we are facing right now in today's context in terms of gender mainstreaming, associated with the projects and program. Thank you.
So after challenges, let's talk a little bit about solutions. So Bhawana, what do you think that are these challenges being addressed adequately? And also what solutions are being suggested and implemented, especially at a policy level?
Well, it may sound a bit of cliche, but when it comes to solution at policy level, I would suggest the first thing is to revisit the entire policy processes and making them more gender inclusive. And to do so, information on gender statistics should be available to policymaker table to have gender informed decisions. If we don't generate or if we don't invest in generating such gender analytics and data, then those information would be based on kind of out of thin air, not having evidence-based research would lead to that kind of gender neutral and blind policy and practices. That's something we need to do at policy level. At institutional level, there are several approaches. I would like to pick up with stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement, with various stakeholders where women and also different groups, indigenous people that are excluded by ethnicity, religious, political affiliation, and so on and so forth, need to be engaged, not just at one event of stakeholder engagement, but the entire project cycle, each step of the project cycle. And that would trickle down to women, the community level, the grassroots level to raise their concerns. Also, human resources capacity need to be strengthened. At the same time, awareness on gender mainstreaming, what are these concepts and what are the available approaches and tools currently, as our colleagues, panelists discuss here about Jane, through several training and workshop or other capacity development events would be very, very helpful. To improve interagency coordination, again, appointment of gender focal point with appropriate terms of reference with proper capacity is utmost essential. To institutionalize gender responsive practices, I would say buy-in of the leadership is critical. So these are the basically solutions that we can look and work towards solving these challenges to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhawana. And I mean, today's Climate Talks is really special because we are commemorating International Women's Day in 2022. In this regard, I would like to actually ask our guests to offer their final and brief thoughts regarding the year ahead. So as we commemorate International Women's Day this year, what do you think and where we would be in 2023?
Well, looking forward, I think the big next step, and I'm piggybacking a little bit off what Elizabeth was saying earlier on her use case, on how this GEM tool and the data can be integrated into other projects, into other services, so we can get a more holistic view and better understand the risks associated with climate and disasters within Southeast Asia to help support better informed decision-making.
So Dr. Peeranan, how do you see this, and where we will be in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, over the next 1 year, the first thing that we need to do is to find users for the GEM tool and work with them to bring GEM tool for good use. And we will also build capacity on how they can utilize data as an evidence to support their gender intervention activities. Long term, though, I think for us, I can see that we want to not only look at from the data aspect, but more importantly, our gender and social inclusion consideration gotta go beyond that and take the step towards inclusive approach. And that is an approach that is promoted not only by ADPC, but is also shared by USAID and NASA. That will be the heart of our work, even though our work is quite scientific, but there's no way to not include gender consideration into our work.
Elizabeth, what are your thoughts?
So not only looking forward to the next year, but looking back at the 2 years we've just come out of, the COVID pandemic has really accelerated conversations around gender inequality at a global scale, but across sectors as well. So I think that it's also really changed the way that we do conventional programming and the way that we develop our projects. So a tool like this, put in the hands of grassroots civil society, in the hands of communities, could really be a really strong bridge towards actual gender mainstreaming at a community level in terms of informing very important policies around gender integration in climate adaptation programming. So I would hope that we can take our lessons learned from the last 2 years and make sure that this doesn't just stay at a very high level, and I know that the intention of it is to ensure that it goes into the hands of the communities that are meant to be benefiting from it as a resource. So that would be my vision for it for the next year.
So, Bhawana, what do you think that where we would be, especially in terms of policy and solutions and challenges?
Well, I think IWD 2020 has a theme, gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. So I think that theme itself urges each and every one of us to operate, as per gender equality and social inclusion principle for sustainable outcomes. So I would like to see, these policies and practices would basically operate within the principle or a framework of gender equality and social inclusion.
Thank you very much, Bhawana, for your thoughts. And I would also like to thank all our guests for joining us today. Thank you. Our next program will focus on the latest IPCC report. As usual, if you have any comments or questions regarding the content of today's program, please get in touch with us via the ADPC's website, and we will try our best to reply as soon as possible. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you very much. Goodbye.